Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. So today we're going to be talking about watercolor and the very basics of how to use them. Now I have three different types of watercolor today. The tray, which is by far the cheapest, and many of you can probably recognize these from your childhood, at least I can. Then there is the panned variety, which is typically more expensive. And lastly, there are the tubed watercolors, which, if I'm honest, I don't have that much experience with. But today I'll be working with this watercolor travel set from Winsor & Newton. When working with wet mediums like watercolor, the type of paper that you use is very important. The heavier the paper, the better it usually handles the water. I normally use paper of about 300 GSM to avoid having the paper warp and curl up and get all weird. Since we're working with watercolor, of course we'll need some water. I like to have 2 jars, so I have one for rinsing my brushes and one with clean water to mix my colors with so they are extra vibrant. Not too picky about which brushes I use, but I often use one very fine brush to get thin strokes and a slightly thicker brush for blending and covering large areas. Now starting off, I'm going to show you the two most basic techniques when working with watercolors: wet on wet and wet on dry. With the wet on wet technique, you want to start by covering the surface of the paper in water. And then to activate the paint, I also add some water to the pans and apply the color to the paper. As you can see, the color disperses into the water, and once the color has been placed down, it's really easy to move around and blend and change as you want. With this technique, you can get some really beautiful and interesting textures, and often I use this in my backgrounds or when covering larger areas. The next way of putting color on the paper is the wet on dry technique. So basically, when you apply wet paint to the dry paper, you can get much more precise and opaque strokes because the color doesn't disperse. You can still just apply a light wash by mixing a lot of water into the color before putting it on the paper. If you want to blend out harsh lines and create a more gradient effect, you can just wet the brush and work the color away until it fades out. I use this technique the most, I think, but you'll see that soon. And this final example is just how you can mix these techniques and get different effects that work well together. As you can see, I'm using the wet on dry technique to paint the fine details and harsher lines, and the wet on wet technique for that typical watercolor look. And now I'm going to use these two techniques to create a larger watercolor piece. For the skin, I'm applying a very diluted wash of pink so the layer is very thin. Now the best way to build up your colors, at least the way it works best for me, is to add many layers of light washes, letting the paper dry each time. You just have a lot more control over the way it turns out. I typically use a very translucent blue for the shadows, like under the eyes, and a more saturated pink color around the eyes, nose, and mouth. I don't think there's much else to say. This is just a fun little piece to demonstrate. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you have any ideas or questions, please feel free to leave a comment down below. And otherwise, I'll see you in the next one. Bye!